Usually, when we talk about a poison, there's a very specific physical expectation.
Right.
Like if a snake bites you, the venom attacks your nervous system. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing gets shallow, your blood might even, start to coagulate.
Yeah, it's highly visible.
Exactly. A doctor in an emergency room can look at a monitor, point to the crashing vitals, and say, there it is, that's the poison.
Because it's a biological assault.
Yeah.
We understand that on a fundamental level. I
Mm.
mean, we expect a toxin to break down the machinery of the body in a way that is violent and measurable.
Welcome, everyone, to today's Deep Dive. I'm your host, and I'm joined, as always, by our resident neuro expert.
Hello. So glad to be here to unpack this one with you all.
And what we are unpacking today is a chemical that completely defies that traditional expectation of a poison.
It really does.
Because it leaves your heart beating normally, your lungs keep working, you can walk, you can talk, you can even hail a taxi. But internally, your free will, your actual ability to form a memory or make a decision or just say no has been entirely deleted.
Yeah, you are, for all intents and purposes, hacked.
Hacked. That's the word for it.
It's the absolute definition of hijacking the human operating system. You aren't destroying the hardware at all. You are completely rewriting the software, specifically targeting the user's agency.
Which brings us to our topic for this deep dive. Today, we are tracking a substance that has genuinely earned the title of the most dangerous drug in the world.
On the street, it's known as devil's breath.
Devil's breath. And our mission today is to take all the sources we have and strip away the sensationalized Hollywood-style lore. The tabloid headlines about mindless zombies roaming the streets.
Right, because we need to look at the heavily documented reality instead.
Because the truth of how this chemical steals human willpower is honestly far scarier than the fiction.
Oh, absolutely. Far scarier because it's rooted in verifiable neurobiology, chemistry, and quite literally thousands of years of human history.
So we're going to take you on a journey today that connects true crime in modern South America, the evolutionary defense mechanisms of plants, the terrifying European witch trials, a catastrophic medical misstep in the 1900s, and the CIA's highly unconstitutional quest for a truth serum.
It really is a perfect encapsulation of how human beings constantly try to harness the most dangerous elements of the natural world.
Usually with devastating unintended consequences.
Always with devastating consequences, yeah.
So before we get into the massive global economy behind this drug, we need to establish exactly what it physically does to a human being.
We need a baseline.
Right. Let's look at a baseline case from Bogota, Colombia in 2012. We have a British man in his 50s. We'll call him Fernando.
Okay.
He's on a routine business trip. He sits down at a hotel bar for a beer. A stranger approaches him, strikes up a conversation. It's the most unremarkable, standard social interaction you can imagine.
I mean, millions of these exact interactions happen every single day. There's no raised voice, no physical threat, no weapon drawing.
Nothing. But the next thing Fernando knows, he opens his eyes and the sun is shining.
Wow.
It is an hour before noon the following day. He is lying in his own hotel room. He is profoundly confused, incredibly nauseous, and has a massive, terrifying gap in his memory.
And it isn't just the fuzzy, fragmented haze of, like, having too much whiskey.
No, it is a complete void. An entire day of his life is simply missing from his brain.
A total blackout. And when he goes down to the hotel lobby to try and piece together what happened, the reality sets in.
The staff tells him that a local taxi driver had brought him back to the hotel hours earlier.
So he wasn't passed out in an alley somewhere.
No, he had been awake. He had been wandering around a notoriously dangerous neighborhood, looking completely dazed.
He was walking around. He was functioning.
Functioning enough that when he finally checks his bank accounts, he discovers two massive, unexplained withdrawals. His accounts have been completely drained.
That stranger at the bar had slipped devil's breath into his beer. I mean, think about the sheer vulnerability of that state. Fernando was conscious.
Yeah.
He interacted with the bank tellers, he operated an ATM, he gave directions to a taxi driver.
He probably just looked like a normal guy.
Exactly. To anyone walking past him on the street, he might have just looked a little lost, maybe slightly intoxicated. But internally, the core component of his consciousness, his ability to evaluate risk, was completely offline.
This is where we need to unpack the science. Because devil's breath sounds like a potion from a fantasy novel. What is the actual chemical identity of this powder?
In the scientific and medical communities, this compound is known as scopolamine, or hyoscine. It is a naturally occurring alkaloid.
So it's not synthesized in some clandestine cartel super lab somewhere.
No, not at all. It grows in the dirt.
It grows in the dirt.
Precisely. It is found heavily in plants belonging to the nightshade family. We're talking about plants with very evocative names like angel's trumpet, jimson weed, corkwood, belladonna.
And these aren't hidden deep in an inaccessible jungle, right?
Not at all. Many of them are just common ornamental shrubs. The drug itself, when extracted and processed, usually presents as an odorless, tasteless, white crystalline powder.
Odorless and tasteless. So you wouldn't taste the bitterness in your beer, you wouldn't smell it in your food?
Nope. You'd never know it was there. And while incidents are rising globally, it is deeply entrenched in parts of South America. In Colombia and Ecuador, the locals often refer to it as borrachera or burundanga.
Okay, so how exactly does a tasteless powder from a nightshade plant turn a grown man into a highly compliant amnesiac shell? Let's drill down into the neurobiology here, because the mechanism is fascinating.
It really is. So to understand the mechanism, we have to look at the autonomic nervous system, specifically the parasympathetic nervous system, which is often called the rest and digest system.
Right.
Our brain and body communicate using chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. Scopolamine acts as an antagonist, basically a blocker, for a very specific, crucial neurotransmitter called acetylcholine.
Okay, acetylcholine. What is its day job in a healthy human brain?
Oh, acetylcholine is a workhorse. In the brain, it is fundamentally responsible for learning, short-term memory formation, attention, and coordination.
And in the body?
In the body, it triggers saliva production, digestion, and muscle contractions. So scopolamine is what we call a competitive antagonist. It enters the bloodstream, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and binds to the exact muscarinic receptors that acetylcholine normally uses.
It takes its spot.
Exactly. It essentially parks its car in acetylcholine's reserved parking spot. The keyhole is completely plugged.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy. I like to think of it in computer terms.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
So the victim is awake. The monitor is on. The power supply is running. They might even be capable of answering questions.
Right.
But because that acetylcholine is blocked from reaching its receptor, the save function to the hard drive is physically disabled.
Yes.
They cannot write new data. They have absolutely no context for what happened 5 minutes ago.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. You are experiencing the present moment with zero historical context.
And if you don't have the context of the immediate past, you have no framework to make decisions about the future. Your critical thinking software just crashes.
It completely crashes.
The command terminal gets stuck on auto-accept. So if a stranger walks up to you and says, "Go to the ATM, take out all your money and hand it to me," you don't have the biological capacity to reference your own internal safety protocols.
Right. You can't ask, wait, why would I do that?
You just comply.
You just comply. Retired pharmacist Dr. Sarah Coggle described this effect perfectly. She noted that it essentially puts the conscious, evaluating part of the brain to sleep.
Wow.
Yeah, it actively severs the pathways that allow you to access your own deeply held protective instincts. You become a passenger in your own body.
Which is exactly why it's been labeled a truth serum in the past,
Yeah.
right? People will just hand over their ATM pins, the keys to their houses, their deepest secrets, without a second of hesitation.
Yes.
But blocking acetylcholine doesn't just erase memory. What is happening to the rest of the body while the brain is short-circuiting?
This is where we see a very specific set of physical symptoms called an anticholinergic toxidrome.
Anticholinergic toxidrome.
Okay, because acetylcholine also controls the rest and digest functions. Blocking it causes profound systemic disruptions. The drug induces severe muscle relaxation. Saliva production completely stops, leading to an incredibly dry mouth.
And their eyes.
The pupils dilate massively because the muscles that normally constrict them are paralyzed. And in high doses, it can temporarily paralyze the victim entirely.
And the margin of error here is what truly makes it a nightmare. We aren't talking about taking a few pills. How much scopolamine does it actually take to trigger this compliant amnesiac state?
The potency is staggering. It takes as little as 10 milligrams to induce the hypnotic state.
10 milligrams. To put that in perspective for you listening, a standard over-the-counter ibuprofen pill is usually 200 milligrams. We are talking about a fraction of a gram.
A minuscule amount. Just a few microscopic specks of dust.
That's insane.
And the truly terrifying part is the toxicity threshold. While 10 milligrams steals your free will, just 1 single gram is completely lethal.
1 gram.
1 gram. The jump from an effective dose for a street robbery to a fatal overdose is a terrifyingly narrow window.
That perfectly explains why devil's breath has absolutely zero appeal as a recreational drug. People are not buying this to have a good time at a music festival.
No, absolutely not. There is no dopamine hit. There is no serotonin rush.
None whatsoever. Increasing the dose doesn't give you a better high. It just plunges you into a state of profound anticholinergic delirium.
Exactly. People are overwhelmed by frightful, nightmarish hallucinations. Their bodies undergo extreme physical stress, racing hearts, dangerously high body temperatures, and eventually respiratory failure.
So nobody wants to take it for fun. It's incredibly lethal. It's an anti-recreational nightmare. But that brings up a massive economic paradox.
That does.
If there is no recreational market, how is there such a massive, consistent supply chain feeding these criminal syndicates in South America?
It's a great question, and it highlights the complexity of global pharmaceutical agriculture. I mean, given the headlines about tourists being drugged in Bogota or Medellin, you would naturally assume that cartels are cultivating massive, hidden fields of nightshade plants in the Colombian jungle.
Right. I picture the standard narco-trafficking setup. Hidden facilities, armed guards, secret labs, refining the stuff.
The reality is completely different. The world's largest producer of scopolamine is actually Australia.
Wait, hold on. Australia.
Australia.
The epicenter of the crime is Colombia, but the supply comes from Australia. That makes zero logistical sense for a street-level mugger. Are cartels hijacking pharmaceutical shipments out of Sydney?
Well, this is where we have to look at the dual-track supply chain. Australia accounts for up to 70% of the global supply of highly refined pharmaceutical-grade scopolamine.
Legal operations, you mean?
Completely legal. Companies like Australia Alkaloids Trading have massive agricultural operations where they cultivate corkwood plants specifically to extract the chemical. And Colombia is actually a massive legal importer of this pure pharmaceutical scopolamine because they use it to manufacture legitimate medications.
Okay, so a highly refined pure powder is legally crossing borders for medical manufacturing.
Exactly. And inevitably, through systemic corruption, warehouse theft, or supply chain diversion, some of that pure pharmaceutical-grade powder bleeds into the black market.
So the sophisticated criminal syndicates have the money and the connections to procure the pure lab-grade product.
Yes, they do.
But the guy who slipped the powder into Fernando's beer probably isn't a cartel kingpin with access to diverted pharmaceutical supplies.
No, he doesn't need to be. That is the second track of the supply chain. The nightshade plants, specifically the angel's trumpet, they grow wild all over the Andes.
Oh.
For a low-level opportunistic criminal, the barrier to entry is just walking outside. They can literally harvest the seeds, leaves, or roots of a wild angel's trumpet bush, dry them out, and grind them into a crude powder using a mortar and pestle.
It's just botanical warfare. You don't need a chemistry degree, you just need a weed growing by the side of the road.
Yep.
But the danger of that crude preparation must be astronomical, right?
The danger is the complete lack of quality control. The criminal grinding up those seeds has absolutely no idea what the alkaloid concentration is in that specific plant. They have no way to measure the dosage.
So they're just guessing.
Totally guessing. They might slip 10 milligrams into a drink and get a compliant victim, or they might accidentally slip in 200 milligrams and trigger a fatal medical emergency.
And we know exactly what that medical emergency looks like because occasionally people do ingest massive amounts of this stuff entirely by accident.
Exactly, yes.
There was an incident in January 2018 in Perth, Australia that is just harrowing. 9 backpackers are sharing a rental house. A package arrives in the mail addressed to the previous tenant.
Right.
They open it up, find a bag full of white crystalline powder, and for some inexplicable reason, they collectively decide that it must be cocaine.
A catastrophic misidentification.
All 9 of them snort devil's breath. The effects are immediate, and they don't get high. They get violently poisoned.
Dr. David McCutcheon, an emergency physician at Royal Perth Hospital, was part of the trauma team that received these backpackers.
What did he see?
His account of the emergency room that night is terrifying. He noted that their hearts were racing uncontrollably, their temperatures were spiking, and they were in a state of absolute frantic delirium.
He actually had to put several of them into medically induced comas. I want to pause on that because doctors don't just put people in comas for a bad trip. Why was that extreme intervention necessary?
Because the body's entire regulatory system was failing. We talked about how scopolamine blocks acetylcholine, which stops sweating.
Right.
If you can't sweat, your body cannot cool itself down. These victims were experiencing severe hyperthermia. Their brains were misfiring so violently, flooded with neurochemical chaos, that they were at immediate risk of excitotoxicity.
Excitotoxicity, what is that?
It's essentially the brain cells firing themselves to death.
Oh my God.
The doctors had to use paralytics and heavy sedatives to completely shut down the central nervous system just to stop the brain from frying itself and the heart from giving out.
Dr. McCutcheon stated plainly that several of those young people would have died without that immediate aggressive intervention. Even days later, 3 of them were still in critical condition in the ICU.
And we must talk about the psychological trauma of the hallucinations, too. The visual and auditory distortions caused by anticholinergic poisoning are uniquely horrific.
Yeah, I've read about this.
We have medical reports of teenagers who ingested the drug, seeing tiny 6-inch tall people crawling out of the walls and over their skin. It induces a state of absolute waking terror.
If someone in that state is left unmonitored, the risk of severe self-harm is astronomical. There are documented medical reports of a man who drank a tea made from angel's trumpet and, in his delirium, amputated his own tongue and genitals.
That's horrific.
Another man simply wandered into a shallow pond and drowned because he had entirely lost all spatial awareness and the basic instinct to stand up and breathe.
Yeah, it strips away proprioception, your body's ability to sense its location in space. It strips away pain response. It strips away the survival instinct entirely. The brain is firing in absolute uncoordinated chaos.
So we've established the lethal margin of error, the terrifying physical effects, and how easily criminals can source it. Now let's look at the tactical execution.
Right.
How do criminals successfully dose an uncooperative target in a public space? Because you can't just force-feed someone crushed seeds on a sidewalk.
The delivery mechanism requires a degree of deception. Spiked food and drinks are by far the most common and historically proven method.
It's ancient, too. If you look at medical journals, there is an account in the Journal of the American Medical Association detailing an incident all the way back in 1883 in Mecca.
Right, pilgrims.
Yeah. Criminals were using the leaves and roots of the Jimson weed to prepare elaborate meals. They would offer this spiked food to exhausted religious pilgrims arriving in the city.
The pilgrims, thinking they were receiving charity, would eat the meal, fall into the scopolamine trance, and be systematically robbed of all their money and jewelry. The tactic hasn't evolved because it works perfectly.
Exactly. Fast forward to 2023. The New York Times covered a case involving a tourist in Bogota. He was on a date. He remembers his date offering him a taste of her soup. He took exactly 2 spoonfuls.
That was all it took.
Within minutes, the drug took complete control. Criminals are incredibly creative. They infuse it into fruit juice, they dust it onto chewing gum, they bake it into chocolate, they even lace cigarettes with it.
But this naturally brings up one of the most heavily debated and sensationalized aspects of Devil's Breath.
The airborne administration.
Exactly. Can you actually be drugged simply by someone blowing a puff of powder into your face on the street?
This is the classic tabloid nightmare. You're walking down the street, someone walks past you, blows a puff of dust, and suddenly you're an amnesiac zombie walking to the nearest ATM.
I've always been highly skeptical of this. Does the science actually back this up, or is it an urban legend?
Well, there is significant debate within the medical toxicology community. Many medics argue that direct absorption through the epidermis, the skin on your face, from a quick puff of powder is highly inefficient and unlikely to cause an immediate, profound loss of willpower.
Right. It takes time for chemicals to cross the skin barrier.
However, the danger isn't the skin, it's the mucous membranes. Professor Camerantia, an expert in drug toxicology at the University of West London, argues that if a fine scopolamine powder is blown aggressively into your face and you inhale it, or it gets into your eyes and mouth, it can absolutely enter the bloodstream rapidly through those sensitive tissues. And the criminals on the ground certainly believe it works. In a 2013 documentary, a local drug dealer in Bogota bluntly stated that when blown into the face, the drug takes effect within minutes.
His exact quote was chilling. He said, "You can guide them wherever you want. It's like they're a child."
Like a child. We also see cases outside of South America utilizing this method. In Paris, in 2019, police dismantled a ring operating on the streets. A man and a woman were approaching elderly strangers, blowing devil's breath in their faces, and then simply following the confused, intoxicated victims back to their apartments to rob them.
Which is terrifying.
In one specific case, they looted $100,000 worth of valuables from a single victim.
They were treating human beings like remote-controlled delivery vehicles.
Yeah. There's also the debate about laced documents, someone handing you a flyer or a map dusted with the powder. Again, medics doubt you absorb enough through the calluses on your fingers to black out.
The risk with laced documents is secondary transfer. You take the flyer, the microscopic powder gets on your fingertips. A few minutes later, you rub your eye, or you pick up a sandwich and eat it. You've just introduced the drug to your mucous membranes or your digestive tract.
Which makes everyday interactions feel incredibly fraught. But criminals are always optimizing their tactics. They don't want to rely on the unpredictability of blowing powder in the wind.
No, they want a sure thing.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The most devastating, highly effective delivery system today relies on the weaponization of intimacy. The honey trap.
It is the ultimate psychological manipulation. By promising intimacy, you guarantee the victim will willingly lower their guard and consume whatever you hand them.
This isn't a new concept, though. Joe Schwartz from McGill University's Office for Science and Society documented how this exact technique was prevalent in the New York City bar scene back in the 1970s.
Oh, absolutely.
Wealthy businessmen would meet attractive women, take them back to their hotel rooms, accept a nightcap, and wake up 14 hours later robbed blind with zero memory of the encounter.
The private environment of a hotel room is the perfect operational theater for a criminal. There are no witnesses, no cameras, and no one to intervene when the victim starts acting strangely.
And today, this old-school honey trap has been completely supercharged by technology. Criminals in South America are aggressively hunting for targets on dating apps. Tinder, Grindr, Bumble.
Yes.
They set up fake profiles, match with unsuspecting tourists or wealthy locals, and promise a romantic encounter.
The victim arrives at the bar or the apartment expecting a date. Their guard is completely down. The biological cocktail of anticipation and arousal is already masking any subtle warning signs. They are offered a drink, and once they take a sip, the trap is sprung.
We need to ground this in reality because the statistics are staggering.
Yeah.
In Colombia alone, public health officials estimate there are around 50,000 poisonings a year involving devil's breath.
50,000.
50,000. And the epicenters are major tourist hubs like Medellin, Bogota, and Cartagena.
And these aren't just polite robberies where you lose your wallet and wake up with a headache. These are incredibly violent, often lethal encounters.
The lethality of the modern honey trap is terrifying. In April 2025, an Italian scientist named Alejandro Codi traveled to the coastal city of Santa Marta in Colombia. He arranged a meetup via Grindr.
And he was targeted.
He was drugged with scopolamine. And 2 days later, his dismembered body parts began washing up in different parts of the city.
It highlights a very dark shift. The violence is no longer just a potential byproduct of an accidental overdose. In some of these syndicates, murder and dismemberment are deliberate features of the enterprise.
In 2024, police in Medellin finally arrested a woman they dubbed the Queen of Scopolamine. She was running a systematic operation, hunting foreign men on dating apps. She successfully drugged 8 men, drained their accounts of over $40,000, and left them incapacitated before she was caught.
The diplomatic community is acutely aware of the crisis. In late 2023, the U.S. Embassy in Bogota issued a stark warning. They reported that 8 American citizens had died from scopolamine overdoses in just an 8-week span between November and December.
8 deaths in 2 months.
8 deaths,
Yeah.
and nearly all of them linked directly to dating applications.
And it isn't geographically isolated to South America either. In 2019, a horrific case made headlines in the UK. A couple used Grindr to lure a man named Adrian Murphy to an apartment. They poisoned him with a lethal overdose of scopolamine and robbed him.
And when police investigated, they discovered this same couple had poisoned another man using the exact same method just days prior.
But here is the most concerning part of the entire epidemic. As massive as that 50,000 number is in Colombia, criminologists refer to this as a crime with a massive dark figure.
Meaning the actual number of victims is likely exponentially higher.
Why? Because of the shame and the sheer mechanics of the drug itself? Put yourself in the shoes of a victim. Let's go back to Fernando.
Okay, Fernando.
He wakes up. He realizes his bank accounts are empty. He goes to the local police station to report a robbery. What exactly does he say?
That is the crux of the issue. He has no narrative. He can't describe the suspect's face clearly. He can't explain how the money left his account.
Right. Did he hand the cash over willingly? Did he type his PN into the ATM himself?
He doesn't know. The systemic response from law enforcement is often dismissive because the victim sounds incoherent or unreliable.
And the internal psychological barrier is even higher. Imagine the profound embarrassment of admitting you were lured on a dating app and bested.
Oh, absolutely.
But beyond the embarrassment is the paralyzing self-doubt. Because your memory is chemically erased, your brain tries to fill in the gaps. You start wondering, Did I do something illegal while I was high? Did I hurt someone? Did I willingly participate in this?
The victims simply have no internal record to advocate for themselves. So the vast majority convince themselves it is safer and easier to just absorb the financial loss, fly back home, and never speak of the incident to anyone.
The gap between the reality on the street and official police data is massive. A 2016 report from the Spanish newspaper El País highlighted this perfectly. Hospitals across Spain were seeing a significant surge in patients arriving in the emergency room, displaying clear signs of anticholinergic poisoning.
They had been drugged and robbed.
But the official police records showed almost zero increase in scopolamine crimes.
The disconnect became so severe that the San Carlos Hospital in Madrid had to publish and distribute their own internal medical guide to help their emergency room staff identify these victims.
Wow.
The patients couldn't advocate for their own care because they literally didn't know what had been done to them. The entire scope of this epidemic is shielded by a wall of chemically induced amnesia.
It is a profound violation of bodily autonomy. But while weaponizing Tinder is a distinctly 21st century horror, the fact that human biology possesses this exploitable backdoor is ancient.
Very ancient.
Let's shift our perspective here. We need to look at the evolutionary origins of this chemical, because the angel's trumpet didn't evolve scopolamine to help cartels steal iPhones.
Exactly. From an evolutionary biology standpoint, plants cannot run away from predators. They can't bite or scratch. So, species within the nightshade family developed a sophisticated chemical defense mechanism. They synthesized scopolamine specifically to deter herbivores.
It is botanical warfare. The plant is essentially broadcasting, if you eat my leaves, you will either lose your mind or your heart will stop. It's a highly effective deterrent for a grazing animal.
Yes.
And yet human beings, being the endlessly curious and reckless creatures we are, didn't run away from the poison. For millennia, we have actively sought it out.
Our relationship with this chemical is incredibly deep. We have hard physical evidence of human interaction with scopolamine dating back over 5,000 years.
5,000 years.
Yes. Archaeologists testing Bronze Age hair samples recovered from a site in Spain's Balearic Islands found clear traces of the drug.
5,000 years ago, humans were deliberately ingesting this neurotoxin. And understanding the neurobiology actually completely recontextualizes some of our most famous historical myths. Take the European witch trials, for example.
Oh, this is fascinating.
We've all heard the folklore witches flying on broomsticks through the night sky, shape-shifting into animals.
The source of much of that folklore can be traced to what ethnobotanists call flying ointments. Keston Fowler from the New York Botanical Garden Press has written extensively about these concoctions. They were a staple of the witch trial accusations thick, usually green pastes made from a blend of local flora.
In 1545, a Spanish physician named Andres Laguna actually documented a specific case. An elderly couple suspected of witchcraft was arrested, and the authorities found jars of this thick green ointment in their home.
And Laguna analyzed the ingredients.
What was in it? Henbane, mandrake, and nightshade, all plants that naturally produce massive levels of scopolamine.
Now, connect this to the physical symptoms of the anticholinergic toxidrome we discussed earlier. We know scopolamine causes profound muscle relaxation, temporary paralysis, and a loss of proprioception.
Proprioception, the ability to sense the weight and position of your own limbs.
Right. The witches weren't physically mounting broomsticks and defying gravity. They were applying a transdermal dose of this scopolamine ointment, usually to the mucous membranes or under the arms. As the drug entered their bloodstream, their acetylcholine receptors shut down.
They became physically paralyzed.
They lost all sense of their body's weight, and they experienced extreme, vivid, terrifying hallucinations.
From their perspective, trapped inside a chemically altered brain, they felt completely weightless. They felt like they were soaring through the air or transforming into beasts because their brain was misfiring in spectacular fashion. It is a pharmacological explanation for centuries of supernatural folklore.
It really is. And it wasn't just European witches either. Historians point to the legendary Greek oracle of Delphi. The oracle would supposedly inhale the smoke from burning nightshade plants to enter a profound trance state. The subsequent delirium and nonsensical babbling were interpreted by the priests as divine prophecy.
It was also used recreationally by the general public in pre-modern Europe, which is baffling considering the sheer terror of a scopolamine trip. There are accounts of people throwing henbane seeds onto hot coals in small enclosed rooms.
Like a sauna.
They were essentially creating a scopolamine-laced sauna, hotboxing the devil's breath to induce a communal delirium.
They also smoked the dried leaves like tobacco, or steeped the herbs directly into vats of beer and wine to produce a state that was described at the time as a pleasant madness.
I cannot imagine anything pleasant about seeing 6-inch people crawling on the walls, but it became so incredibly popular in Germany that in the early 1500s, authorities had to enact strict laws explicitly banning the practice of mixing these herbs into beer. It was a medieval public health crisis.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, indigenous cultures in the pre-modern Americas had developed a much deeper, more sophisticated, and frankly, more brutal relationship with these exact same chemical compounds.
If you read the text Plants of the Gods, it details how South American shamans utilized various species of the angel's trumpet. Locally, they called it brugmansia, or as we mentioned, borrachera, the plant that gets you drunk.
Shamans would brew highly potent hallucinogenic teas for complex ritualistic purposes. They would often mix the brugmansia with tobacco or ayahuasca to amplify and steer the effects. For the Jivaro people of Peru and Ecuador, the plant was a tool for spiritual warfare. Warriors would consume it to gain power and commune with the spirit world before a battle.
But the most staggering, grim application comes from the Chibcha people in what is now modern-day Colombia. When a powerful chief died, the tribe would prepare a massive dose of this hallucinogen. They would give it to the chief's servants, his wives, and his entourage.
And the drug would act exactly as it does today. It chemically sedated them. It stripped away their willpower, their panic response, and their basic instinct to fight back.
Once they were completely incapacitated and compliant, the tribe would bury them alive alongside the corpse of the chief. It is the ultimate weaponization of compliance. You are chemically robbing a human being of their survival instinct right before you execute them.
It's horrifying. But the Chibcha also recognized its tactical value. Decades later, they utilized brugmansia as a primitive form of biological warfare against the invading Spanish colonizers. They would secretly forage the plants and mix the crushed leaves into the food supplies of the Spanish soldiers.
The goal wasn't to kill the Spanish outright, but to break their command structure. The drug caused the soldiers to completely lose touch with reality. It created absolute chaos and panic within the ranks, rendering them incapable of fighting or following orders.
That tactic of dosing soldiers leads perfectly to one of the most incredible, bizarre historical anecdotes on record. It occurred in 1676 in Jamestown, Virginia, during a conflict known as Baker's Rebellion.
I love this story because it shows what happens when ignorant people stumble into a botanical minefield. The British authorities send a contingent of soldiers to Jamestown to quell this uprising. These British soldiers are completely unfamiliar with the local flora of North America. They go out foraging for fresh greens to make a salad, and they end up gathering a massive amount of Jimson weed.
Jimson weed is a potent nightshade native to the Americas. It is packed with scopolamine and other anticholinergic alkaloids.
The soldiers boil the leaves, eat the salad, and the effects are absolutely disastrous. Historian Robert Beverly documented the entire ordeal in his book, The History and Present State of Virginia. Beverly writes that the soldiers who ate the salad turned into natural fools for nearly 2 weeks.
His description is a textbook, perfectly observed clinical account of anticholinergic delirium. Medics today use a mnemonic to remember the symptoms of this poisoning: mad as a hatter, blind as a bat, red as a beet, hot as a hare, and dry as a bone. The soldiers exhibited every single trait.
Beverly's imagery is absurd and terrifying. Because they were blind as a bat, their pupils massively dilated, they couldn't see properly. Because they were dry as a bone, they couldn't swallow. Beverly describes one soldier who spent hours endlessly blowing a feather up into the air.
Oh, wow.
Another soldier was furiously darting straws at the feather, convinced he was fighting an enemy. A third soldier, stripped completely stark naked, sat in the corner of the fort and just grinned like a monkey, making faces at anyone who walked by. A fourth was frantically trying to affectionately kiss his commanders while violently sneezing in their faces.
It was a theater of the absurd. And because of the slow digestion of the massive amount of leaves they ate, this wasn't a quick trip. They were trapped in this state of profound manic delirium for 11 days.
11 days.
Their commanding officers actually had to physically restrain them in their quarters to prevent them from severely injuring themselves or wandering into the wilderness and dying of exposure.
And the punchline to the whole ordeal: After nearly 2 weeks of acting like completely deranged lunatics, the drug finally clears their system. The soldiers wake up. And true to the neurochemical nature of scopolamine, their acetylcholine receptors switch back on, but they have absolutely zero memory of the preceding 11 days.
Run.
They just wake up, probably covered in bruises, profoundly dehydrated, with no idea how they lost nearly 2 weeks of their lives.
It's a stark, almost comical reminder of the sheer power of these plants. It explains why, in many indigenous cultures, only highly trained shamans were ever permitted to handle brugmansia. The risk of permanent psychological damage or death was just too high.
And even for the shamans, it took a massive physical toll. Colombian journalist Alexander Prieto Osorno researched this extensively. He noted that shamans who regularly conducted rituals using brugmansia tended to die significantly earlier than those who didn't. The repeated strain of hyperthermia, racing heart rates, and neurological stress literally wore their bodies out prematurely.
So for thousands of years, this plant was magic, it was warfare, it was divine prophecy, and it was a tool for execution. But as we transition into the 18th and 19th centuries, the Age of Enlightenment arrives in Europe.
Right.
Science decides it is time to drag this ancient, chaotic magic into the laboratory and tame it into precise, measurable data.
The goal was to harness this neurotoxin for human benefit. But trying to tame a plant that evolved specifically to break the mammalian brain came with some horrific collateral damage.
The transition from folklore to pharmacology was a slow process of isolation. It begins in 1750 with an Italian physician and naturalist named Giovanni Antonio Scopoli. He's sent by the government to study the toxic effects of mercury mining on workers in what is now Slovenia. While wandering the mountains there, he begins cataloging local flora.
He comes across a peculiar shrub with purple and yellow bell-shaped flowers. The locals call it the henbane bell.
Scopoli documents its potent effects and publishes his findings in 1760. Recognizing the significance of his work, an Austrian botanist later officially renames the plant genus Scopolia in his honor. This is the crucial first step.
Right. It takes about a century of advancing chemistry, but eventually a German researcher named Ernst Schmidt discovers the specific active chemical compound hidden within the plant. He names the compound scopolamine after Scopoli. Shortly after that, another German chemist, Albert Luddenberg, successfully extracts and isolates pure scopolamine in a laboratory setting.
Once they had the pure, isolated chemical, researchers could finally study its effects without the unpredictable variables of brewing teas or chewing seeds. They ran animal tests and early human trials.
And what did they find?
The lab results confirmed exactly what the shamans and the witches had known for centuries. The compound caused profound sedation, severely disrupted the central nervous system, wiped out memory, and impaired basic reflexes.
The medical community now possessed an incredibly powerful neurological tool. The debate was, how do we use it ethically? And this leads us to one of the darkest, most controversial medical procedures of the early 20th century.
By the late 1800s, physicians were desperately searching for new anesthetics. German Dr. Richard von Steinbuchel began advocating for a radical new approach to manage the immense, often agonizing pain of childbirth.
We have to set the scene here. 19th century obstetrics were barbaric. The alternative at the time was using a crude combination of chloroform and ether to essentially suffocate the woman into unconsciousness.
It was incredibly dangerous. Chloroform carried a massive risk of sudden cardiac arrest or respiratory failure for both the mother and the infant. So Steinbuchel began experimenting with a highly potent cocktail, a mixture of scopolamine and morphine. He theorized that small doses could relieve the pain without putting the mother into a dangerous coma.
In the early 1900s, two other German doctors, Bernhard Kronig and Karl Gauss, took Steinbuchel's theory and scaled it up massively. They experimented on over 2,000 women in labor. They would administer this morphine and scopolamine cocktail at the onset of labor and then continually top it up with additional injections every few hours, tweaking the ratios of the drugs as the woman progressed.
They codified this proprietary procedure and branded it Dämmerschlaf, which translates to twilight sleep. It was aggressively marketed as a modern medical miracle.
I have to stop here, because the marketing of twilight sleep was a massive lie. The reality inside those delivery rooms was a horror show. Jessica Cartwright, writing for the Arizona State University Embryo Project, described the actual procedure. The doctors, Gauss and Kronig, literally had to strap the laboring women to their hospital beds using thick leather restraints.
It's unbelievable.
They would blindfold the women, they would cover their ears with oiled cotton to block out all sound.
It was total sensory deprivation combined with extreme chemical and physical restraint.
I just can't wrap my head around the ethical justification. How could doctors look at a pregnant woman strapped to a bed with leather belts, screaming and thrashing wildly, and call that a painless childbirth just because she couldn't remember it afterward?
It is a profound philosophical nightmare. The doctors fundamentally conflated the memory of pain with the experience of pain. Because the morphine provided some analgesic effect, but the scopolamine completely wiped the hard drive, the women woke up hours later with a baby in absolutely zero memory of the agonizing labor.
But they felt it in the moment. That's why they were thrashing against the belts. The scopolamine didn't stop the pain, it just trapped them in an amnesiac hallucinating state where they couldn't process it or remember it.
Exactly. But you have to view this through the lens of the early feminist movement, which adds a deeply tragic irony to the story. Women were terrified of dying from chloroform or suffering the sheer agony of unmedicated 19th century childbirth. When the lay press began heralding twilight sleep in 1914 as a marvelous discovery, wealthy women actively campaigned for it. They demanded access to it, believing they were fighting for medical bodily autonomy.
They were fighting for the right to be strapped to a bed and chemically lobotomized during the most vulnerable moment of their lives. And that massive demand is what ultimately led to the catastrophe, because as we discussed, the margin of error with scopolamine is microscopic. Gauss and Kronig were meticulously adjusting doses, but when the procedure was exported to the US and the UK, who was administering it?
Untrained nurses and general practitioners who didn't understand the volatile pharmacokinetics of the drug cocktail.
The results were horrific. The untrained administration led directly to a massive spike in maternal deaths from overdose. Furthermore, the cocktail severely depressed the central nervous system, which artificially prolonged the labor process. The uterine muscles wouldn't contract properly.
This drastically increased the likelihood that the infants would be trapped in the birth canal. When the babies were finally born, often extracted violently with forceps, they were heavily depressed by the morphine and scopolamine that had crossed the placenta. They were born blue, not breathing, essentially overdosed before they took their first breath.
By 1915, the medical community and the public finally woke up to the carnage. The mortality rates couldn't be ignored, and twilight sleep was largely abandoned in favor of safer, localized anesthetics like epidurals. But the medical community's failure didn't mean scopolamine was put back on the shelf, it merely changed hands.
Right.
Because while the obstetricians were horrified by the maternal death rates, law enforcement had noticed a very intriguing side effect in those delivery rooms.
Yes. The attending doctors and nurses had consistently observed that the women under the influence of twilight sleep in that brief window before the heavy delirium set in were answering questions with complete, uninhibited candor. The brain's deception mechanism, the cognitive effort required to construct and maintain a lie, was completely offline.
And the police saw a golden opportunity. We moved from the tragic delivery room directly into the cold reality of the interrogation room, the birth of the truth serum.
The transition from failed anesthetic to interrogation weapon was spearheaded by a physician from Texas named Dr. Robert Ernsthaus. In 1921, Dr. House began specifically conducting experiments on women in labor. He wasn't focused on managing their pain. He was explicitly dosing them with scopolamine to test if they would accurately answer his personal questions while incapacitated.
He was essentially interrogating pregnant women while they were high on devil's breath. He was so thrilled with the results of his impromptu delivery room interrogations that in 1922 he took his show on the road. He went straight to the Dallas County Jail.
He convinced the authorities to let him administer scopolamine to suspected criminals, and he interviewed them while they were under the influence. Based on these experiments, Dr. House boldly proclaimed he had discovered the ultimate tool for justice, earning himself the dubious historical title of the father of truth serum.
The initial results seemed like a miracle for law enforcement. There was a famous early experiment where two men who seemed incredibly guilty based on circumstantial evidence were dosed with the drug. Under the heavy influence of scopolamine, they both confessed, but they confessed to being innocent. They vehemently denied the charges, even while their brains were completely compromised.
And crucially, those men were later formally acquitted of all charges following thorough independent trials.
It looked like a silver bullet. The drug forced the men to tell the truth, and the courts later proved the drug was right. The momentum behind this was massive. By 1928, the highly respected Journal of the American Medical Association was publishing articles openly theorizing about the drug's potential.
They argued that scopolamine produced a state where a person emerged to talk from their subconscious mind and to reveal truths that they had secreted during full consciousness.
The adoption by U.S. police departments was swift, and it quickly devolved into brutality. An article in the Science History Institute's Distillations magazine notes that detectives began using it to check the veracity of standard confessions. They would sweat a suspect in a normal interrogation, secure a confession, and then immediately drug the suspect with scopolamine and ask the exact same questions.
And if the drugged suspect's story matched the sober confession, the police deemed it the absolute, unvarnished truth.
But they didn't just use it to check facts. They weaponized the fear of the drug itself. A 1931 U.S. Government Commission report on police brutality explicitly detailed how officers used scopolamine as a tool of psychological torture. I want you, the listener, to imagine sitting in a windowless interrogation room in the 1920s. You are a suspect. The detective doesn't even need to inject you. He just places a medical syringe full of clear liquid on the metal table.
He tells you it's the truth serum.
He tells you that if he injects you, you will lose your mind, you will hallucinate, you will betray all your secrets, and you might never fully recover your sanity. Knowing what we know about the 6-inch people and the terrifying delirium, wouldn't you confess to absolutely anything just to keep that needle out of your arm?
It was outright coercion, masquerading as cutting-edge science.
Okay, I have to push back on the fundamental logic of this entire era of policing. So, what does this all mean? We just spent the first half of this deep dive establishing that scopolamine causes severe cognitive dysfunction, a complete detachment from reality, and horrifying visual and auditory hallucinations. How on earth did trained detectives and doctors believe that anything said under the influence of a potent hallucinogen could be legally or logically considered the truth? You aren't tapping into the subconscious, you are tapping into a chemical fever dream.
That is the exact critical flaw. The foundational premise of the truth serum was entirely biologically backward. Scopolamine does not compel a person to tell the objective truth. It destroys their capacity for critical filtering and induces extreme, profound suggestibility.
It goes right back to what the cartel dealer in Bogota said: you can guide them wherever you want. If an aggressive, biased detective leans over a drug suspect and asks leading questions like, "You hid the gun in the river, didn't you?" the suspect's brain has no defense mechanism to analyze the question or deny it. They just auto-accept the premise. They will agree with whatever narrative the interrogator presents.
Precisely. The drug was essentially manufacturing false confessions by echoing the detective's own theories back to them. And the failures of this method were spectacular and highly public. The most damning example was a massive kidnapping and murder case in Hawaii. A wealthy family's son was killed, and the police zeroed in on the family's chauffeur as the prime suspect.
They dosed the chauffeur with scopolamine, and under the influence, his willpower broken, he fully confesses to writing the ransom note. Case closed.
But when the drug wore off and his acetylcholine receptors began firing normally again, the chauffeur realized what he had said and completely retracted the confession. The police, arrogantly confident in their miracle serum, decided to drug him a second time to prove he was lying. But this time, under the influence of the drug, the chauffeur vehemently maintained he was completely innocent.
The miracle truth serum was directly contradicting itself. And the nail in the coffin was that weeks later, the actual murderer was caught with hard physical evidence. The chauffeur was completely exonerated. The scopolamine had demonstrably forced an innocent man to confess to a capital crime.
That kind of catastrophic public failure led to massive legal pushback. The judicial system finally started looking at the science and realizing it was a nightmare for civil liberties. In 1931, a court in Seattle granted a landmark injunction, specifically barring the police from drugging a suspect during an interrogation.
Legal scholars woke up to the reality that forcibly drugging a suspect to bypass their conscious will was a blatant, grotesque violation of the constitutional right against self-incrimination. The Journal of the American Medical Association, which had previously heralded the drug, completely reversed its stance. They issued a statement declaring that to dope a man to confession would be as distasteful as to extract evidence by torture.
The definitive legal death blow came in a famous 1926 ruling. A man was convicted of a crime, but he had insisted he was innocent while under the effects of scopolamine. He appealed his conviction, demanding that his scopolamine-induced claims of innocence be formally admitted as evidence. The appellate judge dismissed the appeal entirely. In his ruling, he absolutely roasted the scientific validity of the drug, comparing the advocates of truth serum to people who believe in magic potions and cures by faith.
By the 1930s, domestic U.S. police forces officially abandoned the drug, and the courts formally banned any confession procured through chemical coercion. But the fact that beat cops couldn't use it didn't mean the federal government was done with it. As global conflict loomed, the military picked up the baton.
The stakes were higher. The Science History Institute noted that during the Second World War, the U.S. military directed intelligence scientists to aggressively study psychoactive drugs that could force captured prisoners of war to reveal tactical secrets. Scopolamine was at the very top of their list.
The Nazis were also heavily experimenting with it. In the early 1940s, before they fully implemented the industrial horrors of the Holocaust, Nazi doctors actually debated using massive, lethal doses of scopolamine to quietly mass murder psychiatric patients in the very first experimental gas chambers. They eventually abandoned the idea because the drug was too expensive to synthesize at that scale compared to carbon monoxide. But the sheer cruelty of the intention is chilling.
Even the CIA launched extensive, highly classified studies into scopolamine during the early days of the Cold War, hoping it would be the silver bullet against Soviet spies.
But why did all these military intelligence agencies eventually abandon it? If the drug so effectively breaks the human will, shouldn't it work perfectly on a captured spy?
Because of the intense physical side effects. A drug that breaks the mind also breaks the body's ability to communicate coherently. The CIA eventually declassified a document under their historical review program that explicitly detailed why scopolamine was a complete failure for intelligence gathering.
I have that document here. It states, and I quote, "Among the most disabling side effects are hallucinations, disturbed perception, somnolence, and physiological phenomena such as headache, rapid heart, and blurred vision, which distract the subject from the central purpose of the interview."
The subject becomes so violently ill, so completely immersed in their own terrifying anticholinergic hallucinations, that they are literally incapable of answering complex tactical questions. You cannot extract coherent troop movements or submarine coordinates from a man who's screaming in terror because he believes his skin is melting or that giant spiders are crawling out of the walls. The so-called truth serum was simply too chaotic and toxic to be useful to a spy.
So if we look back at the resume of this chemical, it evolved as botanical warfare, it was used as shamanic magic, and a tool for ritual execution. It was a disastrously lethal labor anesthetic. And it was an unconstitutional, highly toxic, failed truth serum. That is a wild history of destruction. Where does that leave this incredibly potent chemical in modern society today? Because it clearly hasn't disappeared from the world.
It hasn't disappeared at all. In fact, it occupies a fascinating medical paradox today. When modern pharmacology finally learned to respect the razor-thin margin of error when we stopped trying to push the dose to the absolute limit, we found that scopolamine has incredibly narrow but absolutely vital modern medical applications.
It is currently FDA approved, but obviously not for childbirth or interrogating suspects. It's approved primarily to treat severe motion sickness and to prevent post-operative nausea and vomiting.
Remember earlier when we discussed how acetylcholine controlled the parasympathetic rest and digest system?
Right. It regulates the gastrointestinal tract.
Exactly. Blocking acetylcholine effectively cuts off the neurological signal from the inner ear and the stomach that tells the brain we are spinning, empty the stomach. It acts as a profound anti-nausea agent. But the challenge for modern doctors was, how do we harness that specific gastrointestinal benefit without accidentally turning the patient into a hallucinating amnesiac zombie?
The answer was delivery method. The most common way it is prescribed today is via a small transdermal patch placed directly behind the ear.
The patch is a brilliant piece of pharmacological engineering because it entirely solves the dosage problem that plagued Gauss and Kronig in 1914. It contains a microscopic dose of scopolamine. Instead of flooding the bloodstream all at once, the patch acts like a highly controlled microscopic IV drip through the skin. It releases the chemical incredibly slowly over a period of up to 72 hours.
It micromanages the dose. It drips just enough scopolamine into the system to block the nausea receptors in the brainstem, but not nearly enough to cross the threshold into cognitive impairment, memory loss, or hallucinations. You can wear it on a cruise ship and play shuffleboard perfectly normally.
Medical practitioners also utilize it in other highly specific scenarios. Ophthalmologists use very weak, heavily diluted scopolamine eye drops.
Why eye drops?
Because the sphincter muscle in your iris, which constricts the pupil when exposed to bright light, relies entirely on acetylcholine to contract. If you drop a tiny amount of scopolamine directly onto the eye, it blocks the receptor locally. The muscle paralyzes, and the pupil springs wide open, allowing the eye doctor to clearly examine the retina.
Anesthesiologists also use it. Before major surgery, they might need a patient a tiny dose to actively dry out their mouth and throat. By blocking the saliva production, they significantly reduce the risk of the patient choking on their own secretions while they are intubated under general anesthesia. It's also used off-label to manage severe withdrawal symptoms in narcotics addicts and, in rare cases, to reduce the agonizing muscle tremors in people suffering from Parkinson's disease.
However, there is a massive caveat regarding its use in modern medicine. Doctors generally refuse to prescribe scopolamine to elderly patients. The risk profile shifts dramatically as we age. For an older brain where acetylcholine levels might naturally be lower, even a microscopic dose from a transdermal patch can trigger severe confusion, acute memory loss, and extreme cardiovascular stress.
And even for a perfectly healthy adult using a properly calibrated patch, the side effects are not trivial. We are talking severe dry mouth, blurred vision, constipation, extreme drowsiness, irregular heartbeats, and sudden spikes in body temperature. It is a heavy-duty, serious pharmaceutical. It requires absolute, strict medical supervision.
Which brings us full circle back to the reality of the streets in South America and beyond. The fact that street-level criminals are actively weaponizing this highly volatile, medically complex chemical with absolutely zero regard for dosage, body weight, or human life is what makes it uniquely terrifying. They are playing Russian roulette with the neurotoxin.
We cannot stress this enough. This is not just a historical curiosity. The ongoing threat is incredibly real and active right now. Just recently, the U.S. Overseas Security Advisory Council issued a severe urgent warning. They reported a massive growing wave of people being drugged with devil's breath in Guayaquil, which is Ecuador's largest and most populous city.
And what was striking about this report is that the attacks were not happening in hidden, seedy underground clubs at 3 a.m. They were happening in broad daylight. Victims were being dosed at busy shopping malls, at public gas stations, and outside popular, crowded restaurants.
The audacity of the criminals is staggering. So let's connect everything we've talked about today directly to you, the listener. We've spent an hour exploring the deep history, the complex neurobiology, and the grim true crime statistics. But what is the practical application of this knowledge? How do you actually stay safe in a world where borrachera exists and is actively being deployed?
The crucial takeaway from the biology is the only true defense against a chemical that bypasses your free will is hypervigilance before the chemical ever enters your system. Once it crosses the blood-brain barrier, you cannot fight it with willpower. You cannot tough it out. Your brain is simply no longer yours to command.
Exactly. The experts have laid out the golden rules, and they are absolutely non-negotiable, especially if you're traveling in known hot zones like Colombia, Ecuador, or even popular European tourist destinations. Number 1, never, ever leave your food or drinks unattended at a bar or a restaurant. If you get up to go to the bathroom, that drink is dead to you.
Yep.
Leave it on the table and order a fresh one when you return.
Number 2, be hyper-cautious of accepting anything consumable from strangers, no matter how friendly, attractive, or harmless they seem. The 1883 pilgrims in Mecca thought they were receiving a charitable meal. The 2023 tourist in Bogota thought he was just being polite by tasting his date soup. The delivery methods are designed to look like normal social grace.
And number 3, which is perhaps the most critical warning in the modern era, maintain strict, unyielding physical boundaries when meeting people from dating apps. The honey trap is the single most effective delivery system criminal syndicates have ever devised. If you are meeting a match, meet in a highly public, well-lit place. Monitor everything you consume. Buy your own drinks directly from the bartender. Do not let the biological promise of intimacy override your basic, fundamental situational awareness.
It is a very sobering reality.
Yeah.
But understanding the precise mechanics of the threat, knowing exactly how the trap works, is the first and most vital step in mitigating it.
I want to thank you for guiding us through this incredibly dense topic today, synthesizing the dizzying history, the intense biological mechanics, and the sheer criminal ingenuity surrounding Devil's Breath is no small task. I think we've firmly established that the reality of scopolamine is far more complex and, frankly, far more terrifying than the tabloid zombie headlines ever suggest. It isn't magic, it is a brutal, incredibly precise biological hack.
It's been a fascinating exploration. When you step back and look at the history of scopolamine, it is essentially a mirror reflecting humanity's ongoing, often tragic struggle to control the natural world, and quite often, our desire to exert total control over each other.
Before we go, I want to leave you, the listener, with one last thread to pull on. Something that really struck me in the research. We talked extensively about how the application of this drug is constantly evolving. Well, currently, scopolamine is actively being tested in major clinical trials as a potential rapid-acting treatment for severe treatment-resistant depression. And researchers are also heavily utilizing its unique interaction with the acetylcholine receptors in advanced Alzheimer's research.
That's amazing.
Consider the profound, Almost unbelievable irony here. A chemical that was literally used by cartels to completely erase human memory and utilized by interrogators in the military to violently strip away free will is now being studied in modern laboratories to help restore the fading memories of Alzheimer's patients and to free people from the paralyzing mental prison of severe depression.
It's quite the paradox.
If the exact same compound that so violently breaks the human mind might also hold the key to repairing it, what does that tell us about the incredibly fragile, paradoxical tightrope of our own brain chemistry? It really makes you rethink the line between a poison and a cure. Remember where we started. We expect a poison to be a physical assault. We expect the broken bone on the x-ray, the crashing vitals, the stopped heart. But Devil's Breath proves that the most terrifying threats don't break the body at all. They just rewrite the software of who we are. Keep questioning the world around you, stay vigilant, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.